So many cars, yet so few plugs. Welcome to the Urban EV podcast, where we speak to industry leaders and EV owners with boots on the ground to read the tea leaves on the direction of the green energy revolution. I'm your host, Rob Hoffman. Joining the show today is Ben Prochazka, Executive Director at the Electrification Coalition, a nonprofit dedicated to ending the nation's dependence on oil through electrified transportation. From city halls to Capitol Hill, Ben has been on the front lines of transformative change. We'll explore the Electrification's coalition mission, what's worked, what's stalled, and what a recent federal court ruling means for the rollout of NEVI funding across the country. Ben, welcome to the show.
Hey, Rob, thank you so much for having me on. It's a great pleasure to be here and to talk to you about EVs at such an important moment.
It really is. It's a real pivotal moment right now, and we're going to dive into what's going on with both EV credits and that NEVI ruling as well. But before we do that, you've worked across public health, environmental advocacy, and clean tech. Can you fill us in on your background and how that path led you to the Electrification Coalition?
Yeah, no, it's in some ways I got here by accident. I wasn't planning to plug in, but sometimes those are those best moments. But I've spent my entire career working on sort of social change, and whether it's environmental, public health, human rights issues. And so I actually started by knocking on a door, raising money for the environment in Massachusetts many, many moons ago for what people now would call Environment Massachusetts, but there's several organizations like that across the country. It's a super hard, challenging job, but it really taught me a lot around how do you connect and talk to average, everyday people about important issues and the role that they can play in changing the world. That starting point for me, from the first door knock, then led to where I ran those offices, learned a lot more about how do you manage bigger programs, and then led to lots of other things where I actually helped run international campaigns for the Save Darfur Coalition, which was working to end genocide in Darfur. And in some ways, that project and that program, along with some other work that I've done, led me to where I am today. I was working for a consulting firm called Fieldworks. We were doing some support for the Electrification Coalition to organize mayors and chambers of commerce to pass a bill called the Electric Vehicle Deployment Act. And that bill, if it had passed, would have basically funded cities to do sort of focused action around the transition to transportation electrification. And in doing that job, I started to get very interested and curious about what EVs mean. The idea that oil dependency has really put our nation at great economic and national security risk, and oil has a monopoly on our transportation system. And then basically the Electrification Coalition reached out and said, hey, we want to run a community-based project in Fort Collins, Colorado, where I happened to live at the time. And I was interested in getting more deeply involved. And so I said, hey, this seems like a great opportunity to do this right now. And so it was called Drive Electric Northern Colorado. And we basically worked with all of the different sort of nodes, if you will, within a city. So the fleets, the utility, the major businesses that are there that obviously have some of the largest employers in the country, in that region. We worked with the dealerships. We worked with major OEMs. One of the first fast chargers in the entire Mountain West was installed at the Fort Collins Children's Museum as a part of that project. But that was back in 2013. And so now fast forward to today, and I've stayed here because I really saw the idea that this was this big industrial revolution that was about to take place. And I was in at the ground floor.
Yeah, that's really the early days of it all. So obviously a lot has changed from 2013 to today. So why don't you dive a little deeper into Electrification Coalition's mission and its mandate?
Yeah, so the Electrification Coalition was founded in 2008. And it has a sister organization called SAFE. But the basic gist is the theory that oil has this monopoly on the transportation sector and it puts us at great economic and national security risk, what are the best scalable alternatives? How do you change that dependency? And so EVs or electrification became the sort of best scalable alternative. 92 to 93% of the vehicles on the road require oil to get from point A to point B. And we had this really interesting part of this, which, I think is still important today and maybe even more important, which is we had a team of industry titans and the military personnel who were getting engaged and going, this is a real problem and the U.S. needs to solve it. So we wrote the electrification roadmap. It still is this incredibly important document that describes all of the policies and actions needed to make this transition happen. But then over time, And since I've joined in 2013, we've gone from one employee, me, to now about 30 staff across the country. And we work at the local, state, and federal level. We work with cities on things like fleet transition. We've created market solutions like aggregated purchasing programs, which is basically like, how do you have cities buy vehicles faster or charging faster? And then also getting into things like medium duty and heavy duty and school buses, because those are now where the technology has finally met the need, right? So great to identify the problem. Now we actually have the technology ready for the solution. And that's the exciting part, even though maybe we're in a bit of a challenging space right now.
So, what is it exactly that makes Electrification Coalition different from the other EV focused organizations out there, right? There's quite a few of them these days.
Yeah. One is that we absolutely believe we have to engage both sides of the aisle in a very, very direct way, and that our wins are going to be pretty limited, or in some cases, we're going to see losses if we don't do a better job of talking about the broader benefits of electrification. And I think, I get why we are where we are, but in some ways, it was a mistake to make EVs about climate solution, because it feeds right into the debate and where we're having this sort of political difference. And so if we had focused on the idea of the technology and the idea that this is a global competition and the rest of the world is going electric, and so the US needs to maintain its automotive leadership, which we've had for so long, and $5 trillion industry a year kind of thing. That's been a really important part, is we engage both sides of the aisle and really think about how do you get more conservative voices supporting transportation electrification. The other thing I think that makes us different, not only the mission, but is also the idea that we get our hands dirty. So we actually do real projects that are working directly with partners, whether it's cities, it's ports, it's other entities, to actually get EVs on the road.
So, very recently, there's been some big movements right now of the needle, one with the NEVI funding and the other one is with the EV subsidies. Can you talk to us about both of them? We can start with the NEVI funding, because Trump came into office immediately. One of his first moments in office there, hey, we're going to pull the plug on the NEVI funding, which is the funding for the electrification infrastructure, the charging network. A federal judge just reversed that, or I think did. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, the federal judge basically was an injunction, basically saying, no, you have to let the money out. It's obligated funds. And it was, it's NEVI and some other programs. But I think in general, it was 14 states that were part of this suit. We aren't involved in that. That's not what we do. We don't generally get into the sort of legal side. But I think it is an important moment where, it should be the case when cities and states and other partners have a signed contract with the federal government to do this important work, even though there might be a change in who's, the leadership, right? And in the administration, like, you can't, as you say, you can't just pull the plug on these programs that are already obligated and should be happening. And so, not every state's going to agree and be involved, but I think these are states who were really far down the line to build out part of this national electric vehicle infrastructure program, which is basically putting chargers on highways and interstates across the country. And then also programs like the Charging Fueling Infrastructure Program, which is a competitive grants program. But basically, there were cities or regional efforts that had come up with, how do you put charging across the country, or, in these particular areas, so that anybody who wants to drive an EV is going to have access to charging wherever they might go. And that's really was the design and intent. And the good thing is this injunction basically means the federal government has to follow through on that obligation, and these programs should move forward.
Yeah, being basically what you're saying is a deal is a deal. So yeah, so that's good news, or in theory, it's good news. Let's talk about the EV credits right now. So that is a place here where the federal government does have the power to rescind those credits, and it looks like it's happening. Can you fill us in on what's going on there and what city and local governments can do to fill the void?
Yeah. I think getting caught up in the politics is really what's happened. But basically, there were two landmark bills that passed during the last Congress and during the Biden administration. One was called the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, or IJA. And that was basically an infrastructure bill that supports the Department of Transportation and their role in our transportation system. And so that's where the NEVI funding was allocated, and it's where lots of other programs are funded, things like the FTA Low-No program, which is basically money that's designed to support transit buses, and sort of how do we make those electric or alternative fuel. So it's a transit bus program that's been in existence for a long time, but it just plussed up and created more resources available for that. And then the other major bill that passed was the Inflation Reduction Act. And so sometimes people call them Uncle Bill and Ira.
Yeah.
Just an easy way to remember them. But the Inflation Reduction Act really was a landmark generational level investment that said, hey, the world is going electric. There is huge competition. Countries like China have gone, their auto industry only started in 2008, right? But they've gone bananas and they've gone
All in.
yeah, they're
Yeah.
so much faster than us. And so they've made investments in minerals. They've made investments in building out battery supply. They've got vehicle production that's happens. But the problem with China is they're not accountable to the quarterly earnings statements that we think about in the US and how businesses operate in the US. And because they have an authoritarian regime, they ultimately can also make a lot of other choices that democratic institutions can't, right? And so it's the Inflation Reduction Act was really designed to reshore and friendshore the industry and to stimulate action and drive private sector investment.
Which it feels like it did at first, right? I feel this program was a success.
Billions to trillions of dollars of aligned investment. So sometimes it's, we think of this as government largesse, right? But the reality is there are and were battery plants and manufacturing facilities that were being built across the country or committed to. And right now those are in limbo. And then you have a double whammy, which is the tariff stuff makes those even more questionable about what's the right decision there. But there's the mega plant that was built in Savannah, Georgia by Kia. And that was a direct result of meeting this investment opportunities in these moments from IRA. Before we get too far afield on all this stuff, I would just say there are a couple key provisions. 30D, and these are like wonky and hard to remember, but basically that's what creates a tax credit on purchasing a vehicle. But the important part of that is it's split into two pieces. It requires the company that makes that car has to assemble it in the US, right? So that's one part of that credit. The other part of the credit is that the contents of that vehicle can't come from foreign entities of concern. And that's something that's defined by the State Department, but it's basically all the minerals that are in that vehicle, the battery, et cetera, they can't come from places like China and other places to meet the credit. And it's for two purposes. It means it incentivizes building those battery factories in the US or our allies, but it also ensures that we can establish that competition because we have to have the demand side. So getting people to buy the vehicle, and that's why it's a tax credit that is for consumers to purchase. There's also 30C, which is the charging credit, and it's basically supporting a tax credit to build out charging infrastructure across the country, in addition to a whole bunch of other things like 45W, which is a commercial fleet credit, and some other things. So there's a bunch of stuff wrapped up in the package, but ultimately at the end of the day, the incentives were designed to have a whole of government and whole of US action to ensure we stay competitive in this new market.
I understand. I'll take the opposition side for a second. This was supposed to be a stimulus at a certain point. This is where business takes over. Are they pulling the plug at just the right moment where private enterprise can take the ball and run with it? Or is this too soon for us to stay competitive?
It's too soon. If you're in the auto industry, you don't build a factory in 1 year. You don't plan your vehicle assembly and the access to the supply chain. That is not something that just happens like that, right? It takes a long time to negotiate those deals. Where do you get the nickel from? Where do you get the magnesium from? Where do you get cobalt from that maybe is not coming from places like Congo, if that's part of your battery? And those are important details. And so all of these companies were responding to that and making this transition so that they could meet the opportunity. And so now all of a sudden they make these big investments. They expect this to be the demand side part of this still there, right? That tax credit. And then you're pulling the plug. And so it's a cliff, right? In many ways. And it's why it's such a problem. And what we've always pushed with Congress is take a scalpel to the provision, not a sledgehammer. And right now that's not what they're doing.
That sounds like it's falling on deaf ears, right? Yeah, especially with this Republican-dominated Congress right now, it seems like we're heading in this direction. Now, can you, since you're so in the weeds right now, can you explain what just happened and when those EV credits are going to truly get yanked? Because even though they're going to yank them, there's still a whole timeline here of it getting approved and getting implemented. It's not going to happen right away, right?
This is where it's like so in the weeds, Rob. It's like,
That's why we got you here,
ridiculous,
Ben.
right? In some ways, I'm apologetic to your listeners because it's like, it make your ears hurt and your brain bleed. But so a bill passed the House and it established a whole set of changes to the Inflation Reduction Act credits and canceled most of them, if not all of them. That had different timelines. So it sunset some of them at different points, right? And it's really wonky. And so if people really want to know what the timeline is, I would say go to our website because it is a moving target. And so what we say today might not be true by the time the final bill passes. So now fast forward. What normally happens is then the Senate takes up their version of, and some people might have heard of it, the big, beautiful bill, but they've taken up their version. And the Senate and the House don't always agree on what to do with this stuff, right? And so right now they are in slightly different places. And some parts of the bill in the Senate are better for EVs and other parts are worse. It actually ends the tax credit for 30D much faster than the House proposal, but it extends out one of the other provisions. And so it's just this thing where it's like, so what happens now is we're still trying to push Congress to do the right thing and maybe recognize that you need to give a little bit longer timeline for these credits. But the House and Senate ultimately, assuming it passes the final Senate in its current form, then they'll have what's called conference. The Senate and the House get together. They have to agree on the final proposal and where there were differences. And then if they do that and they pass it, then it goes to the president to sign. And the president called for that signature to happen the week of July 4th. So like we're talking really fast.
Oh, wow.
Of when this could happen.
Okay, that's incredibly fast. I was hoping this was going to get dragged out for another, 3 to 6 to 8 months. I guess that's not the case.
Probably not, but there are some other things that have nothing to do with electrification that are wrapped up in this.
As they always are with all these bills, yeah.
Yeah, Medicaid funding, Medicare funding, like there's other stuff. And so, those are things that ultimately could slow things down. I don't really think it's going to be EVs.
Okay. All right. Yeah. Yeah. So not the greatest news, but not the end of the world either.
It is important ultimately that the EV market eventually succeeds. And you brought that up earlier, that it's like these, our incentives and our investments, they can't last forever and they won't need to. But we are at this point where we're scaling manufacturing, right? This is a big transition that is taking place and it is about this global competition. And so it's why we need it right now. Absolutely, the market is going to succeed on its own. And there's great examples of that already where Norway, 90% to 95% of all the vehicles sold right now are electric. And it's because they moved past that early adopter phase to mass adoption. And now you wouldn't buy a gas car except in very extreme examples. But that's because the market got there. And we're going to see that same thing in the US. It's just a much bigger country and we're a little bit more complicated.
Yeah, for sure. Recurrent just posted a tipping point timeline of their projections for when the majority of cars sold will be EVs, and they have a whole map of the U.S. And for me, it looked very promising. 2027, 2030 for a lot of states, like it's coming. I think in the end, all these federal provisions here in the EV tax credits are certainly going to help move things along. I think we both know, and I think most of our listeners understand as well, that this is inevitable. But the fact that we're slowing things down and cutting off our noses to spite our face while China, without the complete lack of regulations, going full speed ahead is just kind of mind-boggling. And just for me to get on my soapbox here for a second, of course, we've implemented the tariffs. We're keeping all the Chinese vehicles out of here. But last I checked, it's a global market, and all of our domestic manufacturers sell vehicles overseas. And most of those overseas markets do not, well, they've got tariffs as well, but not like we do. And the Chinese, it's a fair level playing field for the Chinese, and they're going to continue to eat our lunch in most of those marketplaces.
Yeah, I think lots of people are starting to recognize the risk associated with the Chinese dominated EV industry. And right, if they're sort of the only game in town, and in some ways they deserve some credit, right? They've made great strides and they've done a ton of things on the tech, but it goes back to that central theme of maybe right now they are willing to sell the battery, but maybe there's a point at which they go, nope, we have to buy the car, right? We're not selling anything unless you buy the whole car. And then they are also, there's a story that I just looked at yesterday where it's like they're playing a goofy game with selling new cars as used EVs and sending those out of market. And that's one of the ways that they're showing and demonstrating their sales.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, listen, they're aggressive. They're going to bend the rules. They're going to do what they can. They're big enough and they've got the federal subsidies or whatever. However, this is China works things out where they can sell things at a loss. Apparently BYD started a price war recently with the other manufacturers. You got XPeng, you got NIO. there's going to be a lot of Great Wall. There's going to be some consolidation, but they got some major players, and from a technological standpoint, they're ahead of everyone else. I mean, maybe Tesla, maybe Rivian, but pretty much, they're all software-defined vehicles. Their infrastructure is moving ahead at light speed as well. With they got the mega chargers. They are, for better or for worse, when you have a totalitarian state and they make the right decisions, they can move much faster.
Yeah.
And it looks like that's what they're doing right now. I think they've dialed this in pretty well.
As you sort of paint this, dystopian isn't the right word, but like they're, this
Yeah.
idea that they're it's actually the opposite of that in some ways. But I do think like all hope is not lost. And, it just means we're in this messy middle a little bit. And I think there's three things that we need to be doing to fix this, right? Like one is we just have to do a better job of broadening the aperture around why EVs make sense and not have it be centered in this climate debate. And while that might be true that they help climate, and that's a really great benefit, it's not it's not working to drive the policy. And so at this point, the policy decisions need to be centered much more around economic and national security, global competition, and ensuring we preserve the US auto industry. So that's one. Number two is there's an important, and you asked the question earlier and then I didn't answer it, but it's like, what can states and cities do? States and cities have, in many cases, often been at the leading edge of this work, right? California
We're
is a
here in
great
New York.
example.
We're pretty aggressive over here, actually, with the state subsidies.
Yeah, and I think in some cases we these are investments, right? Sometimes subsidies is a dirty word, but it's like what we're really doing is making a decision to invest in a technology, and it's like hockey. We're skating to where the puck is going, not where it is. And so smart states, unfortunately, there are lots of smart states and there's lots of great state leadership. They have an opportunity to rise up in this moment of a gap in federal leadership. And I think states are going to jump in and say, we're going to provide the competition. We're going to demonstrate our leadership opportunity. We're going to recruit companies to come to our state and build EVs that are going to be a part of this global future, because we know we want to be here for the long haul, not just this short moment where maybe there's the last opportunities to, hold on to the internal combustion engine. And then I think cities are also playing an important role. They're rolling out important programs because, one of the biggest moments or values is that EVs save consumers money, right? Because you're plugging into a grid that's domestic. It's essentially price stable versus oil and gas, which goes up and down all the time, right? Oil and gas is manipulated by bad actors around the world. We're seeing what's happening in Iran with, the Strait of Hormuz being closed, and that potentially closes off oil tankers from getting to many markets, including the US. And so that's going to affect oil prices, but EVs can stay static. And so one of the biggest opportunities for increasing one's economic opportunity is transportation costs. And so that's the other reason states and cities view this, is they're going, oh, we can ensure our residents or our community has the best opportunity for economic success by helping support and invest in this new electric transportation future.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to blow my own horn over here. I live in New York City, I believe, as you're aware. And New York City and state have been really helping with the infrastructure rollout, with the taxi cabs as well. That's with all the ride hail drivers. They implemented tax credits to make it much, much more economically advantageous to get an EV. And in just the span of 2 or 3 years, pretty much, I would say at least 50%, if not more, of the ride hails vehicles out there right now are EVs, if not more. It's incredible. Cleaner air. Obviously, now they have a place to charge. It made more sense for them to convert to EVs. And here you go. The flywheel is already in effect. It's a win for everyone. At a certain point, there is a point where you no longer need to have the tax credits or the subsidies anymore. The free market has kind of taken hold, and everyone is happy. And yes, that's our little quote unquote dirty secret, is that benefits the climate as well. But we don't have to talk about that when we're trying to convince the other side.
No, 100%. And, and in some ways it's the idea that we have to convince any side is a problem, right? It should be that this is just a technology solution. It's a better widget. The cars work better. We're just in this transition stage. And then, it is challenging the status quo, which is oil has been a huge part of the US success for such a long time, and hitting peak oil demand and the idea of what that may mean, it's a shift. And so it makes sense that there would be some sort of battle around the preservation of that part of our economic system. right?
I mean, listen, oil and gas, they're going kicking and screaming, as I imagine I would too if I was in their shoes, right? So a lot of the misinformation campaigns and the political and the PAC money is being fueled by them, right? While they're slightly hedged, BP has their, network of chargers, a few others as well. But, they're going to make it difficult. And to be honest with you, their messaging seems to be pretty effective as well, especially on the right side of the aisle.
Yeah, I think, there's a lot of disinformation that exists out there. And so I do think if you're a consumer and you're like EV curious, right? Like just ask somebody who owns one, because oftentimes they're going to tell you the real stuff, right? And like, just like anything, it's not perfect for every single person for every single moment, just like a
Correct.
gas car isn't. But once you own one and once you drive one and once you use it on day in and day out, you very quickly realize all these benefits. And like my house is the perfect example where I had, I'm doing this for a living, but I had to convince my wife that this was a good choice to buy an EV and go through that same question everybody asks. Where do you charge it? Is it going to be able to like meet my drive needs every single day, right? And my house is the other side, which is my wife will never not buy an EV. She can't even begin to tell you how many times she loves skipping the gas station. It was one of those things that was just her least favorite thing to
Your
do.
wife and yours truly, by the way.
Yeah.
It's a wonderful feeling of enlightenment when you just breeze by the smelly gas station and know you never have to stop there again.
Well, not everybody gets the luxury that I have, which, I mean, we live in North Carolina, so we have a lot of garages, right? And like that kind of thing. So I plug in at home. But even in places like where you live in New York, it still can work and work very effectively with access to public charging. But it is a thing where there's more work to do there, right? To give more access to public charging, especially in those really highly urban, like the urban EV, but urban dense places.
It's a work in progress.
Yeah.
There's no question. I would say you've got more of a sort of excuse not to engage in EVs. I have a friend of mine that lives on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, an amazingly dense neighborhood over there. And if you've been to Manhattan, you're familiar
Yeah.
how tall the buildings are, how narrow the streets are, and how many people are crammed in there. Real estate is a super premium over there, and there are so few even public chargers there. It wasn't a viable solution for them. I actually told them it's not ready. If you get one, you're going to be unhappy. You're going to have to travel far to fast charge, which is the least efficient way to charge, because it's more expensive, and typically you go to 80% as well. You're not going to enjoy the experience. While I, on the other hand, have level 2 charging just down the block, it's actually
Yeah.
really easy for me. So no, we're not fully here yet. And like you said, there, an EV is still not the right car for every mission out there, but it is for many right now. There's so many positives, Ben. And one thing which I want to bring up right now is a post Electrification Coalition just posted. Apparently there was a blackout in Gainesville, Georgia, and a resident where somebody told their story where their EV, which happened to be an Ioniq 5, kept the lights, fridge, freezer, and fans running using just 8% of the car's battery throughout the nearly 24-hour outage. That's huge. That's
No, it's
incredible to have your car is your generator. You don't have
yeah,
to worry about this stuff anymore.
yeah, 100%. And frankly, even when there's heat waves and all these things coming, right? This is the other part is you can charge the car before all this stuff happens so that if the grid is having challenges that aren't a function of electrification, frankly, right? But they're because the grid has other issues, right? We're in a heat wave. That's why this is happening right now. So everybody's AC is going on. It is awesome that there are all these other applications that we have yet to realize. But I want to say something about that though. Sometimes because the early adopters tend to be the sort of nerds, right? Like, and I mean that
Yeah.
affectionately.
Sure.
It sounds complicated and hard and like that's great for them, but it's not for me. And while it does that stuff, the other thing that an EV does is it works just like any other car. It's just faster, quieter, easier to plug in. Like you just plug it in when you get home. You don't have to think about it. And so, sometimes we have a tendency to overcomplicate it because we're trying to sell it so hard instead of it's just a car. It just happens to have a battery and it just works better. And this is what the future is.
I mean, I'll be transparent here. And yes, all the evangelicals, the early adopters, sure, we're just like, it's all rainbows and unicorns. But I do bring up on the show a lot. I think transparency is really important so that, there are no surprises here. And for people who are the EV curious, who I truly try to speak to, that you understand what you're getting into. I've even had, I talked about my early experiences, me, who's an evangelist. When I first got my EV9, my Kia, I had some challenges on the road. with the route planning and the reliability of some of the chargers. And generally speaking, most consumers don't want to learn something new. They already know, they're already indoctrinated in how to work with their gas vehicle. So they just want that exact same experience. It's not the exact same experience. You do have to learn a few new things. It's getting better, it's getting simpler, but we're still, I feel like, and this is back to NEVI and the infrastructure. Essentially, when there's a fast charger on the road every 50 miles, you won't have to, route planning won't have to be such an important part of your journey anymore, because it'll be just like a gas station. There's one at the next exit. And therefore, I don't have to worry about, all right, I'm going to fill up to 65% here, and that'll get me to where I'm going to arrive. And I'll make sure I have 35% state of charge there so I can make it back to the next place. You don't have to have the software do those calculations. You won't have to do those calculations. You just kind of, well, I'm running low, I'll just pull over at the next exit. And that's going to happen. And once that happens, things will get a lot simpler. And I think then it'll just be a lot more approachable to the laggards out there that realize this truly is as simple as a gas powered vehicle. And to be honest with you, it's simpler. And then you can really kind of lean into all the amazing advantages that EVs have to offer.
Yeah, I agree with you. And again, it's like, it's not going to work everywhere right now, right? I do think still, though, for the vast majority of people, an EV will work every single day, every single moment that they need. And sometimes we try to focus on the hardest thing, right? The cross-country trip. And we drove our EV from North Carolina to Moab and back during the time of COVID because we didn't want to fly. And it worked awesome. And in fact, it was better than driving an internal combustion gas car. And that's not just because of what I do for a living. It was a better drive and a better experience. But, I know a lot. And the reality is that when I did that when I've done that 5 years ago or whatever, you talk about your experience, like so much has gotten so much better. So the person going to a lot right now today to think about an EV, like things are so much better than when you bought your first car or when we got ours. And so, it's like sometimes we only focus on the things that were 5 years ago instead of where we are today. And I do think that we've made huge improvements. And so I don't want people thinking, oh, I shouldn't do this yet. You can, and it will work super well for the vast majority of people. Not everybody, but the vast majority of people.
Yeah, and I love when I hear people say, "Oh yeah, I'm waiting for hydrogen." It's like another thing with all
Good
the
luck.
misinformation out there. That's another one of those things that every time I hear, I just sigh. And yes, it's ready now. It's a reality. I think that's what we're all trying to say here, that this is happening no matter what. And for many people right now, you can get into an EV and you're going to absolutely positively love the experience, and it's going to change your life for the better. But things will continue to advance. And it can pay to wait a few more years for certain people. Lots of different people have different missions. And I think if you're still towing a boat long distance, stay with your ICE vehicle. Fleets are another thing right now where you're heavily involved in fleet electrification as well. I think that's one of those places here where the EV play is right here, right now. What's next over the next 5 years?
Yeah. So, I mean, you brought up even Uber, and I would think of Uber or rideshare as a fleet, an example, right? And like right now, 1 in 10 miles for Uber is electric globally. And it just shows how quickly that transition is happening. And if you want to talk about somebody who's price conscious and wants the best drive possible, right? That's going to be a person who literally lives in the car is their business, right? And so I think that that's a great testament to sort of the opportunity. And I think every time an Uber goes electric, it makes it sound like, it's like the angel gets its wings, there's a ding moment or whatever that phrase is. But I think every time an Uber goes electric, that means it's hundreds of people who are getting in and out of an EV, and it normalizes what an EV is, right? And so that's really important about what fleets do. It's normalizing EVs. So how are we doing that? We are working with cities across the country and helping do things like EV readiness policies so that they have to put in chargers at the time of development, and that's just going to speed up infrastructure deployment and support fleets. But then also we've created something on our site called the Drive Tool. And it's a really easy, so if you're like a fleet manager at a city or, county or whatever, or even private sector, you can plug in your fleet data and it'll kick out a report for you in about 5 minutes that says, here are the vehicles you should replace right now. And here are the models that are available. So it actually matches it up to the Bureau of Transportation data to say, here's an EV you can go buy tomorrow or today or whatever that will meet your duty cycle need and your cost needs. And then it also says, here are vehicles that might need something else to sort of make that transition happen, right? Like maybe thinking through different route planning, or there needs to be a different investment strategy. Because not all vehicles immediately make sense for a fleet to transition, but it really kind of takes the mystery out of where does an EV work for fleet managers and anybody who's operating a fleet. And I think that's a really important tool. And then we also created this thing called driveevfleets.org. And it's an aggregated purchasing program. And the idea is if I'm a city or a state or any public agency and I want to buy stuff, I want to procure a vehicle or infrastructure or services or buses or Class 8 vehicles, they can go to this portal and it not only has technical assistance, meaning like what are the things you need to know before you buy this stuff? And that's what we do. But it also, through our partner Sourcewell, has a master contract. So you don't have to go out for bid and do an RFP. Instead, you can just buy it right off of that because Sourcewell has already done that contracting work that governments should do, which is to make sure that they're buying the best product at the cheapest possible price. And so those are a couple examples of things that we're doing to really accelerate fleet transition around the country.
That's absolutely incredible, and I'll be sure to leave that link in the show notes below. Was that right? Okay.
Yep. Perfect. Nailed
Perfect.
it.
All right.
One
Wonderful.
Of those fun check names where the C is silent.
I had a feeling that's some Slavic kind of roots. Where does that name come from?
Yeah, it's Czech in its origin, and I actually was just in Prague, so it was sort of an interesting moment to go back to my roots. But the only thing we didn't talk about, and I don't know that we have to, because I don't know, we covered a lot of ground, and is just the idea of sort of this 38. But I feel like I don't know if that's who
we talked about that. Let's just throw it in there real fast, and okay. I can include it on my notes here. But we got so on a tangent here. I skipped over my note. We could have spent
an hour and a half
there.
talking, honestly, Rob. There's so many places where we just scratched the surface, but.
Well, I got you over here, man. So listen, if this turns into another long-winded thing, I'll just turn it into 2 shows. All right, so let me just continue right here. So Ben, EVS 38, you were just there. Why don't you give us a report on what that show meant and what the ramifications were, what was discussed at the actual event?
Yeah, so this is basically an international conference that brings together the EV industry. So this year it was in Sweden, and I had the opportunity to be on stage to talk about how cities can lead the transportation electrification revolution. But a lot of our conversation today, Rob, is focused on like consumer vehicles, right? Like the car. But the reality is transportation electrification, and I think it shows how far this is and how this is only a question of when, not if, is we are talking about Class 8 trucks. So there are Class 8 trucks there from Iveco or Daimler or Volvo. And I think those are great examples of what is on the road right now today, both in the US market, but also across the world, as we are electrifying semi-trucks. So when you're like, does electrification work? The idea that semi-trucks are being electrified should tell you, yes, this absolutely works. And it is going to happen in all sectors. The other thing I think that's interesting is, what's happening in the US market right now and the slowdown and the sort of, public division is having an impact globally, right? People are really paying attention to the US market. We are one of the largest car markets or truck markets in the world. And so it's creating a lot of concern about what does it look like. And I think to some degree, that is exactly why we need to keep our foot on the accelerator for policy and for investments, because we want all of those companies that are really excited about electrification to see the US as a great home to build their manufacturing and to sell their product. And so it was an interesting time to be there and see how people viewed sort of what's happening in the US right now. And then my last bit I'll tell you is it's, this is a huge industry, and sometimes we just boil it down to a car or a charger. But when you think about all of the supply chain that has to be developed for this industrial transition to take place, it's everything from lithium extraction, right, in brine fields in the Atacama Desert, right? And actually SQM, which is one of the industries that does this, like they're electrifying their mining operation and their buses that are bringing their employees to those sites. But there's just all kinds of things where the jobs and the impacts of this industrial transition are going to have a huge impact globally. But we're just scratching the surface. This is just getting started in many ways.
Yeah, I feel like we have a long way to go. I'm just curious, the Tesla Semi, I mean, it was announced and, rolled out already, even on the road years ago, but it doesn't seem like they've gone into really mass production just yet. I really feel like that's a wild card. Where do you see the future of Class 8 trucking here? Is Tesla leading the charge, or are these other truck manufacturers going to kind of pass them while they seem to be I don't know if they're asleep at the wheel or just distracted by so many other things that are going on right now.
I'm not sure why or what would cause Tesla to go slow or go fast at the end of the day, right? Because, production schedules are hard for everybody. I will say, the Tesla Semi has a big potential to be a game changer. But if you go online and look at some of the videos and the deployments already of some of these trucks, PepsiCo is already using these Tesla semis and demonstrating better results than anybody thought was possible. So it's exciting. But there are many parts of this ecosystem that are being developed, and I'm just going to give you a couple quick ones. There's a truck called Windrose that was recently deployed, and one of our partners, Greenlane, built essentially a truck stop to charge electric trucks, and it's out in San Bernardino, California. And this Windrose truck is a great example where it pulls into the stalls. It has a charger on both sides of the vehicles, and so it is charging at a megawatt almost rate, which is like the super fast charging. And I think we're going to see more and more of that type of thing where these electric trucks are being deployed, and then you have the same kind of ecosystem being developed to support those electric trucks. I would say one last piece, which is ports are also electrifying rapidly. So they call them the yard hustlers, but these are vehicles that operate on a port facility, and they basically take the container off the ship and then put it over on a semi truck. And all of those are being electrified right now. And there's incredible efforts happening through their partners with Prologis, which is one of the largest warehouse companies in the world, who's also starting to electrify warehouse facilities so that it's making that end-to-end experience for trucks possible. And it's why it's going to move really quickly, even if it's, takes a little bit to get heavy with electrification.
We just had a guest on the show, Josh Golowitz, and he worked at JetBlue, where all the ground support equipment there is converting to electrification as well. I liken this to anyone who's a golfer out there. There was a time where you'd had those Briggs & Stratton powered golf carts, and that was the way you drove around a golf course. Then one day you got into a electric golf cart, and you're like, this is better for a lot of different reasons. Forget the smell and the power, and the parking brake is automatically on when you lift your foot off the accelerator. What a novel approach that is. And that's it. And then once that becomes the norm, and you go to the one random golf course that still has a gas-powered golf cart, you're like, this is just stupid. So it's inevitable. And it's so encouraging to hear that industry here is, whether it's in the ports or the airports, that they're embracing this. And once they convert to electric, they're never, ever, ever going back.
I will say, we need to keep our focus on industry to make sure they move quickly, right? Because it's, especially when you're talking about legacy automakers or legacy truck makers, it can be hard to have their feet in both sides, right? Both making internal combustion engine vehicles and also making this electric transition. And I think the policy we create is going to ensure that they produce these really incredible vehicles at the rate that they need to be produced. And that's the incentives, but it's also regulatory forcing functions that are critical. And I'm not talking about taking away your gas car. I'm just saying that we need to make sure that we're creating regulatory certainty around this future, because that's going to be an important step to, making sure the when happens much, much faster.
Yeah, and Ben, I think this is really where you come in, and this is what's so important. It's creating that confidence within industry, because they're hedged right now. The automakers are hedged and potentially losing a lot of money as they kind of are developing EVs and losing money on every one that they sell, but they're still selling gas cars. They have to be confident that this conversion is happening, that the adoption is there. And this is where the regulations come in. And this is where you're really doing some good work here to help and make that happen.
Thanks, Rob. And, I would say everybody should give your podcast a listen if they're not sure and they want to learn more about electrification. It's a great resource, and the people that you have on the show and just the work that you're doing is really shedding a lot of light in what the future of electric looks like and why it's a good thing.
Well, Ben, thank you so much for being on the show. It was really fantastic having you here. For our listeners, we will link the Electrification Coalition website in the show notes, where you can learn more about their programs and how to take action. A reminder to follow us on your social media platform of choice, like, subscribe, and be sure to share with your friends and colleagues. Your review or feedback is always appreciated. Any subject you'd like covered or feel you'd be a good guest for the show, you can find me on LinkedIn. Feel free to connect and shoot me a DM. We will see you all next week with a new episode of the Urban EV Podcast.
Thanks so much, Rob.